Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Neal Kent, the Senior Consultant for Contact Center Compliance and the host of the webinars and summits. I help clients implement and execute best practice in compliance program. Today, we are continuing with our consent series and discussing consent revocation. Little housekeeping, ask questions. The cool thing is at the end, we'll have a lot of content and we've sort of set aside about a half an hour at the end for some intense questions. So make sure you can ask during, but if not, we'll leave time at the end of today's, class. So accordingly, it's my pleasure to introduce our expert panel, and this is my favorite group. Leading off, as always, Eric Troutman. Eric's a partner at Squire, Patton, and Boggs, and he's globally recognized for his expertise in TCPA litigation and compliance. I love this. He's served as lead defense counsel more than 250 national TCPA class actions and has litigated over 1,000 individual TCPA cases. Eric truly is the czar of TCPA world. And by the way, his blog, www.tcpaworld.com, is required reading. You should, if you're not there, go there, sign up. Also with us, first timer, and I'm really excited, Petrina McDaniel, who is also a partner at Squire, Patton, and Boggs in the Atlanta office. And Petrina is also a top litigator and TCPA expert. In addition to that, Petrina is also nationally recognized as a privacy expert, and she does work at that intersection of this complex litigation, regulatory compliance, and consumer privacy, very topical. And one of my absolute favorite guests, and Jeremy, glad to have you back. Jeremy Gladstone is the Director, Assistant General Counsel of Enterprise Regulatory Advisory in CapitalOne's legal department. Jeremy is Cap One's subject matter expert on TCPA, TSR, CAN-SPAM, and other privacy-related laws. So let's jump in. Eric, do you want to do a quick recap on what good TCPA consent looks like?
Sure, Neal, I'll do that. Great to be joined by the Czarina and, of course, the Kingmaker in Jeremy Gladstone. And always so much fun. Great. This is our last of the Masterclass series, highly acclaimed. If you missed the first three, they're available on the dnc.com website. Really good content. But yeah, let's dive in. So look, before we can talk about revocation, we have to talk about how to get consent to begin with. So if we can advance some slides here, let's start talking about some stuff. Who's got the controls, by the way? Who's got the switch today? Who's driving this thing? All right. So look, quick reminder. I know those of you that have attended the other master classes have already seen this. This is old hat, not going to spend a lot of time on it, but remember there are two big things you have to keep in mind when it comes to disclosures to get consent, right? It's what we're all talking about, express consent. Two big things, two big concepts. Concept one, the content of the disclosure. Concept two is the format and presentation of the disclosure. If you don't have both correct, you don't have consent. On content, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. We've already covered this in a great amount of detail in earlier sessions. But content, you need 9 separate components in order to be compliant, and you cannot cheat. You cannot cheat. You cannot lose any of these 9. You must have all 9, or you do not have the required level of consent that you might need in order to use your automated technology. It's black and white, folks. It's yes or no. Either you have it or you don't. Here it is, a free, cool, nifty disclosure for your utilization. Already provided this previously, so here it is again. This is all I'm going to say on this today. So if you don't know what I'm saying right now, probably go rewatch or watch for the first time our earlier sessions. All right, next slide. We know that I just told you content. I gave you the 9 pieces of content. Now let's talk about format. Remember, it is so critical. 2020 was a huge year for courts rejecting both arbitration provisions and consent disclosures where the format of the website was not sufficient to really transparently give that consumer the opportunity to opt in and really understand that they were accepting terms. We went through those examples in previous masterclass sessions. You see here, these are the things you have to keep in mind. Just yesterday, the Second Circuit Court of Appeal upheld the district court's ruling in a case involving Subway sandwiches, saying that your call to action display, Subway, even though it had little fine print at the bottom, was not sufficient to give the consumer conspicuous notice of consent and arbitration because the disclosure was way at the bottom and all the visual elements were at the center of the website. And then even if you went to the little tiny URL, if you found it at the bottom of the display and you took your phone and you entered in the 37 digits that you had to enter in to get to the URL, then you go to the URL, even there, the website page was very unclear, and it would say things like, this website's terms and conditions are as follows, as opposed to the terms and conditions for the SMS text program that you're signing up for are as follows. So if you're going to do a call to action display, if you're going to use a website to obtain consent, you must be clear. You must be transparent. You must do a great job of laying out precisely for the consumer what it is that they are agreeing to. And if you don't, you are in harm's way. And not only are you potentially tricking consumers, but your consent and your arbitration provisions are not going to be enforced. All right, so let's move on to what we're actually supposed to be talking about, which is revoking consent. Once you've got it, there's a bunch of revocation issues. They're all here in these nifty yellow rectangles for you, which is very visually stimulating. And we're going to kind of go through all of these topics. So let's start going through it. First, can consent be revoked to begin with? Let's look at the next slide and find out. Yes, what a surprise. I mean, it would be a pretty short class if the answer was no, you can't revoke consent. But there is a probably, there's a caveat here. And that's because if you have a good contractual provision that says you, consumer, as a condition of this contract, are providing consent, and you cannot revoke or modify that consent, and it's consideration that we as a lender or service provider are providing as part of this contract, then that consent may not be revocable. Now I have to pause there, right? Because that's probably not going to be effective for marketing purposes, since the FCC has said, thou shalt not condition any good or service upon marketing. But what we're really talking about here is kind of servicing consent or informational consent. It's most effective, for instance, in the recurring payment situation where somebody obtains financing, for instance, to buy a TCPAWorld.com mug. Let's say, and they want to pay, $10 a month until the hefty cost of this mug is paid off. If part of that finance agreement is an agreement that the good finance company that went ahead and took a lien on this mug, they're allowed to call you. They're allowed to call you every month if you fail to make your $10 monthly payment. And the case law is pretty solid these days. We've got 2 appellate court decisions against 0 appellate court decisions that say those contractual consent provisions are binding, and they are enforceable, and they are non-revocable. Just like you couldn't change the terms of your mortgage. If you want to pay a lower interest rate, you can't just say, I'm going to pay a lower interest rate. You can't revoke a consent provision by saying, I just don't want to have consent anymore. That's not the way it works, at least in some districts, but you've heard this before. In TCPA world, there's always a split of authority. And at the district court level, not at the appellate court level, at the district court level, we've got 2 cases, one in the 9th Circuit, one in the 7th Circuit, that have basically said, no, these provisions are absolutely revocable, and they may not even be enforceable in any way, shape, or form. But in any event, you can always, as a consumer, revoke. So that's kind of the state of the law right now. Frankly, it's been the state of the law for about 5 years now. It really hasn't shifted too much. It's been a pretty static split, if you will. Petrina, Jeremy, I don't know if you want to kind of chime in on can consent be revoked?
I was just thinking, it seems like ages ago when the Second Circuit first held, I think it was in 17 in Ray's versus Lincoln Automotive. I remember when that case came out, and it was just like, a watershed case that basically, said what you said in terms of consumers not being able to unilaterally revoke consent. That's part of a bilateral contract. But these courts that are still kind of rejecting that black letter law and saying, well, you can't change it without the counterparty's approval, default to this general rule that consent can be revoked at any reasonable time through any reasonable means. And I see Tillman's up there. And I think that that's an interesting case that can be distinguished because the court there based its holding largely on a 7th Circuit decision in a case called Blow versus Bajora. And that case relied on an FCC pronouncement that basically said revocation could occur through reasonable means. And while that's true, the FCC said it in 2015, it was not addressing bilateral contracts in which consent was part of a bargain for exchange. Instead, the FCC was discussing gratuitous extra contractual consent. And since then, the FCC has explained that this reasonable means revocation standard did not intend to affect bilateral agreements. And that was, of course, highlighted in ACA International later in 2018. So I think that the weight of authority is still good on this point, and that's an easy way to distinguish the Tillman and those other outliers there.
So, Petrina, let me ask you a question. So Senator Markey sent a letter with a bunch of other senators several years ago to the FCC, where he said, without a doubt, in his opinion, consumers should reasonably be able to revoke consent regardless of contractual obligation. Essentially, he was sort of saying, FCC, I don't believe in that sort of unilateral ability. And so does that sort of influence the FCC, which then starts to influence the courts?
Well, I mean, I think we still have really good case law on this, though. I mean, that the ACA international opinion is pretty clear, and the FCC actually mentioned that in its briefing, that there was nothing in the commission's order that, of course, was at issue in 2018 that should be understood to speak to the party's ability to agree upon revocation procedures in a contract. And I think that that is still good law. And that's a way to kind of distinguish Tillman, because I think Tillman was decided pre-ACA International, which could maybe speak to why it's a little bit of an outlier here. But I mean, I think context here is very important, in which the FCC was making this kind of reasonable revocation standard.
Yeah, Tillman was actually unfortunately decided a couple months after ACA. ACA was March of 2018, but Tillman, to your good point, it just did not, it swung and missed, frankly, on the FCC. And what essentially Tillman said was, I'm bound to follow the Seventh Circuit's ruling in below until the Seventh Circuit takes into account the FCC change of position in the ACA International opinion. I, as the judge, am just going to follow Seventh Circuit. Mm-hmm. And you know, I think that's the wrong ruling. I think, Petrina, you're exactly right in terms of both the chronology and history leading up and the ultimate effect of the ACA ruling and the FCC's prior pronouncements. But unfortunately, Tillman just kind of shrugged at all of that and was like, yeah, Seventh Circuit said, so I'm not budging. And Singer pretty much did the same thing, you know, much later in time, looking at the Van Patten case out of the Ninth Circuit. And so that's just something that, you know, that's one of the challenges that kind of permeates TCPA world more broadly, is courts kind of just knee-jerking, right? Like, we don't really want to dive into all of this and really try to understand it and get to the right answer. I'm going to find, frankly, the easy way out. And in the Tillman case, they said, hey, look, Blow said, the Seventh Circuit said consent's revocable, so it's revocable, period, the end. And Singer pretty much says the exact same thing. So not really particularly well-reasoned decisions, but they are what they are. Jeremy, anything there, or shall we fly forward?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, if you're, you know, sitting at home, as most of us are, and sort of looking at this, I think you might reasonably wonder why we don't just have contractual consent clauses everywhere, and why that hasn't put Eric and Petrina out of business, or at least onto another business. I think that these provisions have significant reputation effects and impacts, particularly, you know, we talked about marketing, you know, that's a different game, but in the servicing context, right? You know, even in your mug financing example, Eric, which, by the way, like, I want to talk to you about the cost of your mugs after this presentation, but there might be some usury going on there. But, you know, even that example, right? I mean, a customer can't get out from under receiving what they will describe as harassing calls to pay for a mug that, you know, we all know the writing has come off after one washing and the handle is a little bit questionable anyway, right? So, like, even though you might have the better legal argument and super glue, as Eric might have, you might still lose sort of the broader battle if you rely on contractual consent clauses.
I'm going to throw out, it's a good question from one of our attendees. Did any of the cases that upheld contractual provisions that consent is not revocable discuss whether the non-revocable provision was clear and conspicuous?
I love that. No, So these are adhesion contract provisions, and this is another really great example of the difference between informational calling and marketing. Okay, again, this whole thing we're talking about does not apply to marketing. You cannot capture irrevocable marketing consent in a contract. Don't try it. Don't even try it. You'll get yourself killed. Okay, you cannot do that. We're talking solely about informational consent. And when you're talking about informational consent, there are no rules around conspicuousness. And so just the basic rules of mutual assent and reasonable inquiry notice apply in that context. And so you can bury your consent provision in a contract of adhesion that we all know the consumer probably didn't read, and it's enforceable. And that's exactly what's happening in these cases. In fact, in some of these provisions, I mean, it's literally, there's not even a revocation statement. I mean, it's literally just, you've consented. It doesn't even say, and you can't revoke it, right? And it's a contract of adhesion. It's buried somewhere in the terms and conditions, and the courts are going to enforce it. Again, only for information, only for servicing. And of course, to Jeremy's brilliant point, I love having Jeremy. Kingmaker always has like some really salient stuff to say. Reputational risk is a thing. I will call you 100 times a month until you pay for my mug, okay? And there's nothing wrong with the price of that thing. All right, so let's move on, if we can, to the next slide. This is fun. This is really a good time. All right, so we've established that in the absence of a contractual provision, consent is going to be revocable, and it is. And the standard is that it can be revoked by any reasonable means. Lots of fun use cases around what is reasonable. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in the next slide. But generally speaking, that's the standard, right? But it's important to keep in mind for those of you that are receiving calls from consumers and want to know, hey, like, what is a revocation? If they say, stop calling me and hang up, is that enough? If they say, I only want you to talk to me in writing, is that enough? If they say, hey, leave me alone, is that enough? Like, what is a revocation? And the standard is it has to be, again, the manner in which the revocation is communicated has to be reasonable. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But the consumer must expressly request for calls to stop. And there was a really helpful case just from a few weeks ago, May 28th, like 14 days ago now. Actually, not even like 10 days ago, in the Barnett versus Bank of America case. That case is famous, of course, because it was the first post-Facebook case to look at a predictive dialer and find that a predictive dialer is not an ATDS under the TCPA post-Facebook. That was on MSJ, big win for Avaya right there. So that is one piece of Barnett. But the second piece of Barnett that's relevant to revocation is really interesting. The consumer in that case said, only communicate with me in writing. I only want to receive communication in writing. That implied, but did not state, that they wanted calls to stop. And the court said, we don't play the implication game around here. You either expressly ask for calls to stop or you don't. Black and white. And in that case, you didn't say the magic words, consumer, just like the caller has magic words around getting consent. The consumer has magic words around revocation, at least according to this court in North Carolina. Really, really interesting. One thing to keep in mind, though, of course, is that you, as a company that is making phone calls, you can, in a bilateral contract, dictate, essentially, how consent can be revoked, okay? And this is kind of a developing area of law, but just like you can say, thou shalt not revoke consent at all, you can also say, call 1-800 number, right? It has to be reasonable. Right? You can't say, hand deliver a notice to our office in Antarctica or something, but you can dictate that. Again, informational consent, not marketing. Marketing is different, okay? The consumer breeds that they don't want to hear from you in marketing. You should probably stop marketing, okay? It's just too dangerous. But from informational perspective, the standard is different. Petrina, Jeremy, you guys have some thoughts around what the manner of revocation might be?
I think there's a lot of complexity in what constitutes a reasonable revocation. And so, for a company like Capital One, right, we have, some 20,000 agents. There's constantly people coming and going, as is typical for that business. And so I think that while you're absolutely right that there are some good restrictions on revocation, and, part of what I marveled about in the Bank of America case is that they actually went to litigate the issue. As a practical matter, there's a lot of goodness in training your agents and training anybody who's talking with the consumer to be a little bit cautious in the space, and when in doubt, go ahead and revoke, because what you often find is the cost of losing one potential contact is a lot less than the cost of even an individual action or a potential class action in the TCPA space. So while there are great defenses, the sort of lowest common denominator approach can often save companies a lot of money here.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I don't know if these are texting cases, and Eric, we may get to those, but I think also from a compliance perspective, if your texting platforms can catch more than just the perfect stops or whatever the revocation word that you have mentioned in your messages to consumers, I think that is also very helpful because obviously there will be bad actors trying to evade the system to keep receiving messages. And you want to catch those folks in addition to the more reasonable consumers who may just text, please stop, and not just stop. And so if you can design your rules engines on your texting platforms to, to weed out those that are, replying to something other than the standard method of revocation, I think that's important. So you can kind of catch all the outliers who may either be trying to manufacture a lawsuit or actually requesting to stop receiving messages, but just not doing it in a very precise way. And so that's with respect to texting. But to Jeremy's point, I think erring on the side of caution here and being a bit more conservative and construing what's reasonable is always a better approach, in my opinion.
It was pretty remarkable, Jeremy, that they litigated that issue all the way through. That's an interesting point. I hadn't paused to think about it now that you mention it. All right, next slide. So let's talk a little bit more, right? What is reasonable? And we're going to talk through a little bit about exactly what Petrina just said. All right, the totality of the circumstances approach is applied to assessing reasonableness. And anytime you hear totality of the circumstances, you should be very concerned, because what that means is the judge is just going to decide based on whatever criteria they want to come up with. That in legal parlance is the totality of the circumstances, which is basically just saying the finder of fact, the jury or the judge, has really wide discretion to just consider everything about the interaction and decide based upon whatever it is that strikes them as important in the moment, that is what they're going to rely on in finding that the consumer either did or did not consent or revoke reasonably. You can look at kind of cases like, I gave you two examples. There's a bunch of these cases where people send letters to the corporate headquarters. They send letters to some specific branch. Many times these cases are manufactured, right? The plaintiff's lawyer knows full well it's COVID and it's April 2020 and everybody's abandoned their corporate headquarters and like not even the janitors are allowed in the building, and they're sending correspondence, right, to some empty building someplace when they know full well they can just send an email. Or there's a phone number for servicing requests, or there's an address for servicing requests, and they instead just pick like the most difficult, impossible way to trace. They send a letter to the CEO or something dumb. Some cases look at that and they say, hey, look, it's a corporate address. You have to handle your correspondence accordingly. I'm going to say this is a valid revocation. But many cases look at that and they say, come on, you're a customer at Bank of America. And you're a student loan customer, and you email your local branch to revoke consent, or you send a letter to your local branch to revoke consent on your student loan servicing when there's completely separate address and phone number for that. That's not reasonable. But again, because you're looking at totality of the circumstances, this stuff is very in the eye of the beholder. And so you have to Jeremy's earlier point, be prepared, right, to act conservatively and have processes in place. Unless you have a contract provision, which you probably should for at least this sort of thing. So you can at least argue to the court, hey, look, we had an address for this. And they knew it, and they just went ahead and ignored that and sent the goofy letter to some other place where they shouldn't have done. And that's very similar to the cases that Petrina was raising earlier in the stop context. Now, please understand, please listen to me, okay? You will get yourself killed if you say, well, I'm only going to honor a stop revocation if it's a perfect STOP, all capitalized, no period, no quotation marks, nothing, just that, and nothing more and nothing less. That's not reasonable, folks. I'm going to tell you, okay? Like a judge is going to look at you and a judge is going to say, like, you have to be able to handle lowercase stop. You have to be able to handle please stop. You have to be able to handle stop, exclamation point, right? Like anything that is a reasonable, from a consumer's perspective, clear articulation in the text message context that they want you to stop, you're going to have to abide that. And that includes situations where you say, press stop to stop, right? Even where you're giving them a very clear articulation as to how it is they can opt out, you still have to give the consumer a little bit of wiggle room. Now, on the other extreme, right, there are people who plainly try to evade the stop functionality because they want you to keep texting them to set up a lawsuit after they purportedly revoked, right? And you get a lot of those, you know, please knock it off. I'm not sure that I really would like to continue to receive anything along the lines of what it is that you are saying. And it would be much appreciated if you could no longer continue to send the things that you have been sending, right? Like anything that they can come up with to not use the word quit or stop or knock it off, you know, things that might be picked up. So you have to have a process in place if you're going to be communicating using the text channel to be reviewing these inbound communications from consumers. And if somebody says something goofy like that, you should be in a position to knock it off because they're trying to set up a lawsuit, right? And that's what they're doing. Now, mercifully, as Petrina was teeing up, there's some good case law around this, especially where you are telling the consumer as part of each text message, here's how you opt out, right? Stop to opt out. And when they get a text that says stop to opt out, and their response is some long-winded gobbledygook, the court, for instance, in this edible arrangements case, the court in the EPS case, there's a series of these now. The courts look at that and they say, knock it off, consumer. They literally told you, you just had to say stop, and you said anything but stop. So we're not gonna treat that as a valid revocation. But where, you know, again, where you're not providing that stop message in each text, maybe the standard's a little bit more lenient. But somewhere between, you know, stop exclamation point, which you've got to be able to handle, and please knock it off, or, you know, I would please appreciate if the messages didn't continue in the manner in which they are, blah, 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 nonsense, right? Is the gray area where, again, totality of the circumstances, and the court's going to weigh it, and you want to put yourself in a position to be as safe as possible and honor consumer consent preferences, which is what this is all about. Let me pause. Petrina, Jeremy, what is reasonable?
Yeah, I was just thinking, it just takes so much more effort, right, for a consumer to write a verbose, I would really appreciate if you would terminate sending me these messages, right, than just press stop. And that's what the court looked at in edible arrangements. I mean, that's a really interesting case because the court's like, you went through all of this trouble when you could have just said stop. And the plaintiff really didn't have a good argument for that. And so I think, you know, we are definitely seeing a trend where courts are just kind of getting fed up with these obvious attempts at manufacturing lawsuits. But to your point, there is a middle ground here where your systems have to be able to detect these types of outlier responses and the more reasonable ones that will just say, please stop, or, you know, something other than stop. But the message is, you know, please stop sending me the messages. So, that's one of my favorite cases because the court was clearly fed up with this type of shenanigans.
Hey, in the interest of making sure people get their money's worth on this presentation as well as your mug afterwards, Eric, I'll just say that one of the things that we have introduced is where we get a text message that we don't understand, and we try to understand it, as you guys have correctly pointed out, we try to understand as much as we can. We respond with hey, if you want to stop, reply stop. If you want to help, if you need help, reply help. And it's a really good fact to the extent we ever need to defend our text message platform. Say, look, you know, we're trying to honor the consumer's request. They know right here exactly what they need to do. And if they chose not to, that tells you a whole lot about their intent.
Very
I love it. That's great. That's really good stuff. And I was going to try to have AC Evans join us, CEO of Drips. I know they've developed proprietary AI technology where they can recognize like 160,000 different search strings now, or text strings as a probable or potential stop, which is really neat, right? Like as these technology platforms get more advanced, they actually work in the consumer's benefit, right? AI, I'm a big guy, I'm like scared of AI. I don't like it. But there are definitely things where, it's very helpful to have a platform that can detect without having to have a manual review when a consumer says, please stop. Hey, I'd really like it if you stopped, right? Which is actually reasonable, right? Like you can't get mad at a consumer if they're like, hey guys, seriously, stop, please, right? They're saying stop. They're saying, they want you to stop. They're clearly articulating what they want. They're just not using that perfect text, perfect phrase. And so to have that technology to pick that up is great. And of course, Jeremy, your point, look, man, we're just trying to clarify, right? And of course, that's the beauty of the TCPA, right? Poor Jeremy, Cap One's going to get sued because someone's going to say, I said stop, and they sent me a message asking me whether or not I wanted to stop when I already told them I wanted to stop, right? Using my verbose, stupid phrase. And yeah, the lawyers are that bad. They will sue for anything. Okay, so next slide, helpful stuff. Very interesting, very fun. Stop notifications. Let me just hit this one real quick. Technically, you do not have to have a stop notification on every text message unless you are debt collecting, right? There's the new CFPB rules that if you're a debt collector communicating by text message, you do need to have a stop notification on every single text message. Otherwise, technically, nothing under the TCPA requires you to do that, although best practice is to do that with each message, especially in the marketing context, mostly so that you can avoid these opt-out evaders. But also so that you are, again, being totally upfront and transparent with consumers. The CTIA, the gatekeepers for all short code and now soon long code mass messaging, also requires the use of an opt-out provision. That is to say, the opt-out has to be articulated in every mass text. If you can get past those guys, good for you. But if not, that's another barrier to deliverability if you're not using those opt-outs. I don't know, Petrina or Jeremy, you have anything to add on that? If you're going to just hit that real quick. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's talk about the effect of revocation. This is, I shouldn't have to have a slide on this. It should be pretty obvious, but let me say, if the consent is revoked, then you don't have consent anymore. And that shouldn't be a challenging concept, but I have seen it be challenging to operationalize. And we're going to talk about some multi-account scenarios here momentarily. But just basically, right, if you're calling for servicing or informational purposes, or if you're setting up alerts, you have to stop sending automated messages. Now, in the debt collection context and servicing context, it's interesting because, as you know, the FDCPA requires a written request in order for communications to be ceased by a consumer. As we just talked about, the TCPA does not require anything in writing. So it creates a divide, right? If you are in a environment where you're collecting on debt or servicing or potentially a debt collector subject to the FDCPA or CFPB rules, you need to be in a position to be able to manually continue to contact these people if that's what you choose to do. The safest course, of course, is to stop all communication if someone says, orally, stop calling me, right? That's the safest course, but technically it's not required. What is required is that you stop using automated technology, pre-recorded calls, IVR, ATDS calls to that phone number. But the FDCPA, again, requires cease communication requests to be in writing. So if you want to continue to call that person manually, it's a risk, but you can. For marketing, you have to stop. You have to stop. And I don't know why people get confused about this. I love everyone listening, so I'm not trying to be insulting to anybody, but like once in a while, someone will say, well, they told me to stop calling, but I have an EBR, so I can keep calling, right? And I just think an EBR is an established business relationship, and I have to explain, no. The request for calls to stop trumps your established business relationship. It trumps express written consent, for God's sake. It definitely trumps your business relationship, okay? If a consumer says, don't call me, your marketing consent is gone. There is no wiggle room there. It's all gone. Even if you are continuing to do business with that consumer and that consumer continues to buy your product and that consumer is entered into future transactions with you, doesn't matter. You do not have the valid necessary consent. You cannot call that consumer for marketing purposes anymore. Pause there, Petrina, Jeremy, kind of a high level basic slide. We can move on to the more complex stuff where you guys can weigh in. Okay.
Can I throw in a question here?
Go ahead, Neal.
So from the audience, I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. If consent, and this is in regards to a servicing versus not marketing. So if consent is revoked for one channel, is it revoked for all? E.g., example, revoked for mortgage loans means revocation for personal loans?
So that's product revocation, not channel revocation. Let's move on to the next slide because we're going to get to all of that. Yay, look, multi-channel. Here we go. And we're going to talk about multi-channel first, and then we'll talk about multi-product, multi-account. Okay. This is, Jeremy, you're going to have to jump in here. All right. So I'm just going to tee this up real quick. And I will say that the one on the left is a real interaction with something called email. I'll let Jeremy explain what email is. The one on the right, I just made up because I thought it was funny. But what happens when you are using, well, I call this multi-channel, but this is actually single channel. When you're using, just say text messages, okay? You're using text messages to communicate with the consumer for multiple reasons. For instance, you are sending them updates on their account balances because they've opted into that. And they've also opted into ATM withdrawal notifications. And they've also elected to give you consent to contact them to alert them when they're past due on their student loan payment, right? So you've got 3 different channels of communication, maybe from 3 different business lines within your enterprise. You've got, all these are consented, and then the consumer responds to any one of those with a stop. Well, does that mean you have to stop everything or only the one specific type of message that the consumer has asked to stop? And do you have to stop all your channels of communication? Do you have to stop your phone calls too? And to the point of the individual who asked the question, do you have to stop all communications across all your product lines? Even if there's multiple accounts, what in the world do you do? But let's start with the more simple question of different purposes in a single channel of communication. Stuff gets really complicated. It's fun. Jeremy, I'm going to let you kind of take it from here because there's a petition that's out there that I think is pretty useful for people to know about.
Sure. So first, since I'm a Capital One employee, I'm of course obliged to say that is our AI-driven chatbot. Many of the large banks and other institutions have similar chatbots. I happen to think is the coolest. I will note that I'm not biased there. And I'll just plug that is also really good for jokes, bad jokes, but as we've shown earlier in this presentation, this audience likes a good bad joke. Yeah, so when we filed our petition with the FCC, and this is all public record, folks can check it out if they want. And AI were in its early stages. And the ability to disaggregate what a customer actually wants through a text message was really difficult. And that's not to say it's easy now, but rather, we were really on the front end of kind of, any of the algorithms really being able to capture that. And so our petition for the FCC, which if there are folks from the FCC on right now, we'd love to have our petition granted. It's been out there for a little while now. But our petition, really tries to get clarity from the FCC to be able to follow up with a customer, kind of what you see here, follow up with a customer and figure out whether they wanted to stop just one particular type of alert, say, low balance or transaction or whatever it may be, or all text messages. And the funny thing about the TCPA is that technically following up after a stop, other than to confirm that you've been opted out, could be seen as a violation of the TCPA. And so our petition really tries to clear out, what we see as really frivolous lawsuits, sort of things that would only be manufactured, and make sure, honestly, that we can give customers exactly what they want. Now, Eric, I'm really curious about your interaction here on the right, starting with, whether you are actually a Capital One customer. I'm going to put you on the spot there and figure out whether there's some differences in the way this thing looks. I'm curious here.
Yeah, well, the $199, like I got really upset when said that my balance was low. To me, that's a heck of a lot of money. So I was, first of all, I was pretty pissed off that I got called a lowlife by a robot. And so, I asked it for my balance. Then I said, stop. And it got all mouthy with me. I said, stop. What? The balance alert. Dude, are you serious? You just asked me for the balance. No, I'm kidding. Of course, I made this interaction up. I am a Capital One customer, but this is not me, obviously. I made this up because I thought it was funny. The concept that, you ask a robot for something, the robot delivers it, and then you can stop, and then the robot just has to say, okay, to be clear, what do you want me to stop? I mean, it's just kind of an amusing kind of anecdote of our time that, these poor animatronic things have to do our bidding, even when we are wishy-washy, which human beings, of course, being a writhing coil of impulse that can't keep their mind made up on anything, can, one moment want messages, one moment stop messages, then the next minute change their mind again, which makes revocation and the application of revocation, especially in payment, recurring payment scenarios, so fascinating, right? Today, I don't want to hear about my low balance, or I don't want to hear that I owe money because I'm just stressed out. I'm just having a bad day. Just don't call me anymore, right? But 2 months from now, like when I forget to make my car payment, like I would really appreciate that phone call. So I wish that you called me, but now of course it's too late because I had that bad moment and I told you to stop calling me, and you had to stop calling me because otherwise you get sued on the TCPA. I don't know, it's a mess. And that's why I was kind of poking fun at the idea that, robots are so obedient, deterministic creatures, and us human beings are so impulsive, but in any event. All right, so thanks for teeing that up, by the way, Jeremy. Next slide. All right, so multi-channel. Okay, so I give you a general rule here. And Petrina, Jeremy, I'm really interested in this. So I want your take. The way I look at it, okay, this is just my take, not legal advice, right? We're just talking this through. Always get legal advice before you execute on any outreach strategy, okay? Got to do that. But as a general rule, if somebody says stop, or words to that effect, to a text message, you got to stop texting. Okay, probably. Now, if you've got additional consents, I was saying earlier, right? Let's say you've got 3 different kinds of consents. You can make the argument that when you revoke as to one of those consented alerts, that you can continue the other 2. But generally, you're going to want to have that disclosed someplace pretty conspicuously in, again, your terms and conditions, or on your website, or next to the little alert button when they sign up for it. That, when you hit stop in response to this alert, it's only going to stop that alert, and other sorts of texts are going to continue. But kind of more importantly, the way I view the world is that if someone says stop to a text, you can continue to make phone calls to that number. And that's, that's a little risky, okay? But that's the way I look at it mostly, and there's not a lot of case law. In fact, there's no case law directly on that question, which is interesting if you think about it. Like, why is there no case law on that? But the consumer's expectation, I believe, and this is just, the czar's gut as much as anything else, is that stop means stop texting. It doesn't necessarily mean stop all communication or stop phone calls. But the opposite is also true. If someone says, don't call me anymore, okay, that's pretty broad. A call to a consumer essentially is they're requesting that you stop making an outreach to their phone. And if you turn around and put that cell phone number on a text blaster and start blasting them with text messages instead of calling them, do you think you're going to get sued? Because I think you're probably going to get sued. Okay. So, again, there's no case law on that either. That's just kind of my supposition. But to me, that's the way I look at things. Now, if you want to be conservative, of course, if someone says stop calling, you stop everything. They say stop texting or stop in response to a text, you stop everything. By the way, if a consumer says in response to a text, stop calling me and stop texting me, you should probably stop calling them and stop texting them. Okay. All right. So those are my thoughts, but I want to gather, the other panelists. This is why you folks attend, is not just to hear from me. So Petrina, Jeremy, I don't know, you guys want to weigh in on that?
Sure. I'll just sort of put my gloss and amplify what you said. So I often think of revocation as kind of matching consent. So if I capture consent, I call out 4 different channels in the consent, hey, for mortgage servicing, for banking, for auto, for credit card, whatever it is, then it gives me a pathway to revoke for each of those channels. If I do a broad, you're going to give consent to me for everything for servicing purposes, recognizing you can't do that for marketing, you have to be more limited. But if you're going to do broad unservicing, then it creates a reasonable expectation to a consumer that the revocation is going to be broad. I also agree with you on the, revocation by phone. I tend to treat more broadly as a broader revocation than by text. So there's a couple of things going on there. One, particularly in a servicing context where a customer wants you to stop calling them, typically they're just not that thrilled to hear from you, and they're not really engaged or inclined to kind of walk through the scope of their revocation with you, or whether they'd still like to receive text messages. It's more of a revocation and a click. And so in the lack of space to be able to kind of break that down, I'd rather go broad and more conservative, decrease the risk there. I think you have a better argument in text that it's a channel specific revocation. And of course, the FCC has gone on record as saying a text is a call, but hasn't gone on record as saying a call is a text. So there's that legal argument. I see my lawyers are nodding, so I've said something right here. But so there's that additional argument that I think supports the text specific or channel specific revocation.
Yeah, I agree both with you, Jeremy and Eric. So I won't add anything there. But one of the issues that we haven't talked about is that in putative class actions, for example, I think these issues of revocation, especially when we're talking about partial revocation or multi-account scenarios, generally present strong class defenses. And, we know that there's a robust body of case law denying certification of TCPA revocation classes because of just these questions of consent would need to be resolved on an individual basis, and revocation would need to be resolved on that basis because there are differences in the methods of revocation into which account, for example, that revocation would apply. So I would just kind of add that as an additional consideration. I think it's a little bit of a trickier issue when you're talking about compliance and operationalizing it. But I do tend to agree with the approaches laid out. But I think if you're facing litigation and particularly class actions, these types of classes generally just don't move forward because of the individualized issues there.
Good stuff. All right, next slide. All right, multi-account revocation. And this is where, Jeremy, kind of what you were just saying, like needs to be echoed and amplified, to use your phrase, and it's a really good one. If you are a company that takes the position that if a consumer has consented to one product communications regarding one product or one business line, that they've consented to the entire enterprise, and I'm assuming you've got terms and conditions that say that, because if you don't, good luck. But you've got terms and conditions, and they've agreed to account agreements, master agreements, and it says, any product or service by our enterprise, if you've consented to one, you've consented to all. Cool, groovy, good for you. That's probably going to be enforceable. But it is also, to Jeremy's outstanding and important point, it is also going to be the consumer's reasonable belief then that when they tell one of your 22 consumer-facing business lines to stop calling, hey, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and you got my consent to all of your 22 lines one time. Well, I just revoked to all of your 22 lines one time and all of my accounts one time. And there is case law to that effect. This Czar case is a very damaging case in the multi-account in the same enterprise fact pattern, where they said essentially stop calling on all my accounts, period. Accounts, plural, that little S at the end really sunk the defendant in that case, and it could sink all of you, right? If I am a company of fill, or a customer of fill in the blank company, and I say every account I have with you, I'm done. Don't call me anymore on any of them, period. And that's a very clear articulation that I just gave you, that consumer doesn't want to be contacted again by your enterprise, period. You'd be lucky to get such a clear articulation, and you got to find a way to operationalize it. But of course, the trickier scenarios are the ones where it's just stop calling on my accounts, click, right? hey, at least one court has said that is enough for you to know across your enterprise that they don't want to hear from you again. But to Jeremy's good point, I have it written right here on the slide, which I think it's good. Great minds think alike. If you've got consent for each and every single account that you have for each and every single product and each and every single phone number, then you're going to be in a much better position when that consumer says, stop calling me on my accounts, to be able to say, all right, well, they must mean the accounts within this product, or they must mean the phone numbers that I can call them regarding this specific account regarding this product. And you'll be in a much better position to say, well, wait a second, I've got completely separate consent supporting my completely different business lines operations. And I'm not going to stop calling over here. It's going to be a defensible position. But to Petrina's good point, how are you going to figure that out, by the way, on a class basis, right? And that's why getting more and more consents makes you safer, not just from a, hey, I can disregard revocation in some context because it's not going to cover all the consents that I have, but from a class action perspective, how are you as a class member going to figure out and articulate which revocations took place, how, and circumstantially when, against a backdrop of myriad different consents for each and every class member? Way too individualized, right? That kind of class would never get certified. But there's a lot here, so let me pause again. Petrina, Jeremy?
Eric, can I ask let me jump in here for a second?
Yeah.
So going back to your example of consent, right? The consent example for marketing and informational messages, very broad based. And so now, how do we sort of align that with the fact that there may be several different divisions that I'm interfacing with of a company? Or do we say broad-based consent, a stop is stop for everything, right? How do you align, or where do you align? Or to your point, you were saying get individual consents, but yet I started with one. Is a best business practice to say, hey, as you sign up for new products, you get consent for that channel, product, whatever it is, and actually put it in your terms and conditions?
Yeah, I mean, short answer is they have to align, right? And yeah, no, 100%. Best practice is get that consent as granularly as you possibly can. And this is what I tell people all the time, right? There's a big push I have found in industry. I'm not talking about CapitalOne or anybody in particular, but I have found in industry generally, there was a big push the last 5 years to get to enterprise consent. The concept that if a consumer gives you consent one time, you want to be able to build terms and conditions and processes to be able to put that into some central housing someplace and have it drawn on from all your business lines for all their various needs, not marketing, but for all their various servicing needs. I never liked that model. I'm not telling you that it's wrong, but I'm just telling you that's dangerous. And it definitely puts you in a position where then you have to be able to honor revocation enterprise-wide as well, right? It's a goose and gander situation. So to me, to your point, Neal, getting multiple consents, granular consents, every time you have a new touch point, a new account, a new product, a new whatever with that consumer, a new phone number, you want to get a very nice, clean, additional new consent if you can get it, right? And every time you get one of those, you'll be in a stronger position if a revocation takes place on any one of those to be able to continue to call on all the other. And again, you can build into your terms and conditions something that says exactly that. If you revoke one consent, you have not revoked all of your other consents. But what you can't do, at least what I don't think would be enforceable, is to say a provision that says, by giving me consent one time, you've consented to every single one of my business lines. And in order to revoke consent, you must independently tell each and every one of my business lines separately that you are choosing to revoke consent, right? You can't take a broad intake and then require the consumer to run through hoops in order to revoke every piece of that. At least I don't think so. There's no case law on that, but to me, that's probably not best practice and probably won't be
Isn't
enforced.
all initial consent broad in general? That first consent, that TCPA accepted consent says, you're letting me call you for business, for informational and marketing messages. So where in that daisy chain do you now need to get it into an individual basis?
Well, so again, yeah, I think there's a disconnect here. First of all, we're not talking about marketing. Okay, like marketing is you have to put that away. Marketing is always very specific. It's always very limited. Okay, you're never going to have enterprise-wide consent to market across different products and verticals in a single disclosure. If you do that, you're not getting consent to begin with. You've done something wrong. Okay, so that's never even an issue. Secondly, there shouldn't be, again, what I'm saying is you can make a choice as a company to try to capture a broad consent. That's a choice. It's also a risk. It's a risk because although you might be able to use that broad consent for servicing across your entire enterprise, you're also now going to be subject to enterprise revocation. The two have to match. Okay, that's it. That's kind of the basic takeaway here. So Petrina, Jeremy, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add, so implicit in this conversation, I'll just make it explicit. TCPA lives at the account level or the individual product level, right? So when we capture consent for a credit card, account, like we have consent for that one account. If we want to go broader than that, then we need specialized consent. So to Eric, to your point, if you want to go enterprise, you have to have magic language in there that takes it to the enterprise level, and then you're stuck with that. But if you just do a standard TCPA consent capture model, it's for a specific product, it's for a specific account. And so that gives you the optionality to revoke at that same level.
Perfect. Well said. Petrina, any additional thoughts? All right, let's pop on to the next slide. All right. So interestingly, although it's not really that interesting if you think about it, courts apply a slightly different rule in the multi-account scenario where the accounts are resting with a third party, debt collection, right? I'm a debt collector. I have an account for Jeremy, both because he didn't pay for my mug that was provided by one lender, and because he also didn't pay for my t-shirt, and that was provided by a different lender. Both of those accounts end up with me. Jeremy says, hey, look, man, your mug is awful. I'm not paying for it. Stop calling. Well, okay, but can I also keep calling about the t-shirt that a different lender has gone ahead and provided financing for, even though both accounts were with the same collector who was just told to stop calling? And the courts have been pretty good about saying, yes, as long as the lender on the mug had consent and the lender on the t-shirt had consent, revoking one or the other does not revoke both, because they're two different lenders with two different accounts and two different consents. So just because they've both chosen one collector, and that collector just happened to receive a do not call regarding one of the two, that doesn't mean that the collector now lacks consent to call the other. Pretty straightforward, but I think a pretty helpful rule as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Petrina, Jeremy, want to jump in there?
Yeah, I think
Just add the wisdom of pre-shrunk t-shirts, Eric. It's really something you should invest in at some point in the future here.
Okay. Petrina, do you have something on the law?
I'm not think that funny, but to your point about it matching, right? These are two different, it's the same servicer, but two different accounts. But it goes back to what you were saying earlier about just make sure it shores up, and the revocations will match as well.
All right, cool. Next slide. We're kind of getting to the nitty gritty here. Partial revocation. I remember when Schweitzer came out in 2017, I thought, oh my God, this is the biggest case. There's going to be so much litigation around this. How, the sky is falling. We can't operationalize this. It's over. It's over, folks. It's over. And then like nothing ever came of it. I don't know why. It's the weirdest thing. So what Schweitzer holds is that a consumer can partially revoke consent. They can essentially say, don't call me in the morning, don't call me in the afternoon, don't call me at night, don't call me at work. That one's easier to do. Only call me between these hours. And a business has to honor that, or it has to treat it as a complete revocation. And I think the way businesses have handled this is they're just treating it as a complete revocation, and that moots the issue. Because obviously if someone says, call me between the hours of 1:30 and 3 o'clock the second Tuesday of every month, that you're not going to be able to build that in, a little special snowflake program for just that consumer. I mean, I don't know, maybe you can, but I think for most people that pose a real challenge. But you can't call them using automated technology at any other time, because according to Schweitzer, there has been a partial revocation. I'm shocked that there's not more case law around this. I really thought this was going to generate a lot of case law, but it just hasn't. I don't know. Jerry, Petrina, any thoughts on this?
I'm not surprised surprised. I mean, because it's a weird case. I mean, the fact pattern was so odd, and the fact that it got to the 11th Circuit is bizarre. Because I think, and Jeremy, maybe you think differently, but any business would have just said, don't call this person. I mean, it's too granular and it's too odd to try to figure out the right time. And when you're talking about agents and having a standard for calling, I mean, this is a complete deviation and outlier. And so I think businesses just, would err on the side of being conservative and saying, just don't call this person. It's not worth the risk.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the other thing to piggyback on, right? It's really hard to operationalize. This is a really expensive thing to do. And so, and it's not that common of a scenario. So, in many instances, we would just go ahead and revoke. This is echoed in Regulation F and the debt collection rules coming out for the FDCPA around, convenient calling times for consumers. And, again, it's just a really hard thing to actually implement, especially at scale. And so I think that, more often than not, callers are just inclined to walk away from calling than try to, figure out what morning time is. By the way, morning time on the East Coast is different than morning time on the West Coast, right? So there's a lot of complexity here that, you have to think through if you're going to try to actually honor a partial revocation and still call.
All right. So I think that's the end of revocation. I've got a couple slides here. If we move forward on, reconsent, that's important to keep in mind. Once revoked, consent can be reobtained. Always good to keep that in mind. Just because you have had your consent revoked doesn't mean you can never get it back. But it does mean that you have to actually get consent again. Okay, as I was giving you the example before of a consumer that says, don't call me, but then they come back into your hardware store and they buy another broom and you think, okay, well, I can call them again. No. Okay, they have revoked that consent. You don't get to call them anymore. And the EBR doesn't change that fact. But if they give you another consent form that's signed in writing, you're okay. Or I find people really struggle with reconsent is they said, don't call me anymore. And then they call in and they're like, hey, I'd like some more information about X, Y, or Z. And then the enterprise is like, whoa, like, well, I want to call you back to talk about X, Y, or Z because you left me this voicemail. My agent wasn't available to take your inbound call, but I've got a do not call here. What do I do? And that's very, very tricky. And in fact, the safest route is not to call them, at least not to call them using an automated technology. You could use a manual technology in that setting, maybe, but truthfully, even that is dangerous. There's actually no exception to a DNC to make a return phone call on an inquiry. So that's one of those weird little rules where it's not even common sense, right? You would think, hey, look, the consumer wants me to call them back. Let me call them back. But technically speaking, under the TSR rules and under the regs on DNC, technically speaking, you can't call them back, not even manually, which is weird. That's just weird. But I know, that's just, a ticky-tack rule is academic. I don't know of any case law around that, but technically that's how the regs read. That being said, for informational purposes, super easy to get consent. This Lukoff case is a great case because the servicer calls the consumer, says, hey, do we have consent to call you? He says, no, don't call me anymore. I don't want to hear from you. Terrible. Very clear revocation. The facts are actually pretty extraordinary. Very clear revocation. And then the same day he goes on and updates his account preferences. And there was like a little contract of adhesion buried in the terms and conditions where if you change your phone number, you're automatically consenting. And the court said, hey, he changed his phone number. So I don't care that the same exact day he said, don't call me anymore. I don't want to hear from you. Because he changed his phone number online, he accepted the disclosures and he gave consent again. So that case makes me chuckle, but that just goes to show, you can get consent, especially for servicing, very easily. In the marketing context, gotta be written. If you are, for instance, selling a product and the consumer says, don't call me anymore, and then 6 months later, you get a new lead, and it's an express written consent form, and it's got all the 9 requirements, and the format was proper, and it wasn't a dark pattern where the consumer was confused or tricked into providing the consent, you can call, because express written consent is going to trump a previous revocation. Okay. If you get a new valid express written consent, that will allow you to call a consumer even over a previous DMC, but it's got to be in writing. It's got to be in writing. Lots there. Okay, Petrina, Jeremy. Petrina's giving me the thumbs up. Jeremy's giving me the thumbs up. Okay, we're out of steam. So I think that really is all we have on consent. I got a couple slides here on just basic Facebook stuff, but we've already covered that a bunch of times. We've got 11 minutes to the bottom of the hour. Neal, do we have questions? Let's take some questions.
I'm going through a couple. Let's see now. Trying to find the ones that you guys didn't answer. Let's see. You answered the revocation of revocation. Does a revocation of consent to a specific party apply to all parties listed in the marketing disclosure creating express written consent for marketing purposes? It's a mouthful.
It depends who it's given to. That's a great question. Generally speaking, if, for instance, so let's say there's a lead seller. Lead seller gets a lead, sells it to 4 different companies. Okay. If the consumer revokes to company 1 up here, companies 2, 3, and 4, their consent has not been revoked. If the consumer revokes to lead provider, however, lead seller, that lead seller then has to notify 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the consumer's revocation. If they don't, then they are potentially on the hook for future calls made by 1, 2, 3, and 4. Does that make sense? So that's actually a really interesting fact scenario. But generally speaking, revocation is caller specific, right? It's entity specific. Now, another scenario, right? And this is where it gets really interesting. Company 1 buys lead, then hires call centers 2, 3, and 4 to call on that lead. If company 1 is told, don't call me, they have the responsibility to tell call centers 2, 3, and 4 to stop. If call center 2 is told to stop, call center 2 has to tell company 1. Company 1 then has to assure that company 1 and call center 2, 3, and 4 all stop calling on that lead. Okay, because they're the seller. Company 1 has the responsibility to stop all calls on that lead because they've been told through an agent to revoke consent. That would not require company, though, 2, 3, or 4, or lead supplier, first lead supplier, to stop all calls. Does that make sense? This is fun. Isn't this fun? I told you this is fun. But yeah, it's really, I mean, it's tricky stuff out there, but to highlight, it is critical. If you are a seller and you are using a web of third-party call centers or affiliated companies or non-affiliated third parties who are calling to sell your product, if any one of those people is told to stop calling, you have to have a process in place where you are notified of that. And then not only are you documenting that revocation, you are then turning around and letting everybody else in your network who is also calling on that lead or trying to sell that product, that they can't call that phone number either. Okay, that's a really important step. I see that a lot, where a company will say, okay, well, I, the big seller, I, the big company, am not going to call anymore. But then they don't do the next step of like immediately notifying their entire network of callers, hey, this phone number is burned for all of you. That can get you in a lot of trouble. Just ask Dish Network. They got killed for that in that case out in Illinois.
Had an interesting question from my colleague, Ryan Thurman. And really, he's sort of talking about when somebody revokes consent, they're now on your internal do not call list, but where he's going, occasionally numbers change. And so his question is, what's the panel's thoughts about using disconnected and reassigned data to remove old numbers from an internal do not call list, i.e. cleaning up that internal do not call data to remove numbers where the number is now owned by a new person?
Wow. That's kind of brilliant. I would not do that. The regs say you have to keep it on for 5 years. 5 years. The regs don't say keep it on for 5 years unless. I think that's neat. I think it's really nifty because if the phone number really does change hands, then the revocation, which is person specific under the DNC rules, would no longer apply to the internal DNC rules. I get it. I would not be comfortable using just disconnect data. Once the reassigned number database is out, though, from the FCC, I could see the argument. I could see the argument that a permanent disconnect notification via the administrator of that database should operate to permit a company to remove a consumer from the DNC. I would say I would do a petition to the FCC on that, though. That's what I would recommend, is that if you as a company or as a trade organization hearing my voice think that that will be interesting to your organization or to your members, that is something you should seek clarity on from the commission before you act. That would be my recommendation. I don't know, Petrina, Jeremy, that was interesting.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would agree that I prefer to ask permission there than beg forgiveness. I think that there's enough nuance. And I, like you, I sort of see both sides, and I'm not sure that I think that the reg gets you to the right answer. But so there's, it seems like a good petition to bring, but not one that I'd want to do without some air cover from the FCC.
Yep.
So I guess with that in the other scenario, so you had person A with a phone number, mobile number. Numbers change. Person A is still on your do not call list. Now person B with the new phone number gives you prior express written consent. You can call it, except if your protocol is to scrub against your IDNC. Generally, that's number specific in most technologies. You're going to have a conflict there. How do you override? That's, I think, where it kind of gets in. You should have permission to call person B at a number that he's given you permission to call.
Yeah, if you're already so conservative that you are not calling new written consents based on previous IDNCs, then, I mean, the fact that there's an intervening sit tone or intervening reassigned number notification probably shouldn't change your practice. As I said earlier, you don't have to do that. If you have a new written consent that is valid, right? All 9 requirements, proper formatting, valid consumer, real phone number, blah, 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 blah. That written consent trumps the previous IDNC. It trumps the previous do not call, okay? So you don't have to scrub. Now, you should scrub against your known litigator list, but you don't have to scrub against your previous DNC if you have a new perfectly valid lead. So to me, if I have a new perfectly valid lead, I'm not going to do that scrub anyway. But if I am super conservative and I have a new valid lead and I still want to scrub, I don't think it moves the needle much that there was a sit tone. I'm still going to be very conservative and scrub.
Also, I guess, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. It seems on the federal do not call list, a wireless number that was put on the do not call list years ago, even though it may have changed, is still on the do not call list. There's a little bit of a problem there. Be interesting to see when the recycled number database comes out, and we'll get some data hygiene here, versus some of this noise. But it does sound like, regardless of that, the most important thing I heard all of you guys say, consent, 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 prior express written consent, solid, documented until revoked, really is the best way to go. It's clear, conspicuous, unambiguous.
Yep, get it done right. It never expires. It trumps previous DNCs. It protects you no matter how you're making phone calls. It protects you if the phone number is on the DNC. You got to get that express written consent. That's what it's all about. That's the gold standard. That's why we had a 4-part series, Masterclass series on it, which is coming to an end. All right, Neal, anything else? We got 3 minutes. Otherwise, I'm going to close this sucker out. I'm just going to say bye to everybody. What do we got?
I think this was great. Once again, thank you, everybody. Consent, I think, is the most important topic that we've had to tackle. It sits at the top. There's still a lot of people that are confused, to your point, on what that consent language is, and then revocation. I think you guys did a fantastic job in addressing revocation. This whole series, please. Other questions? I know we had a bunch. Hopefully we answered them. At the end, you can reach me, nkent@dnc.com. I will filter your questions to the experts. I want to make sure that you are comfortable and living in a world where you're not heading down that slippery slope to litigation. And these guys are the best at it. So once again, I want to thank the panelists. I'm going to go around the room. I'm going to tee it up with Petrina. Any final comments?
No, thank you so much for hosting us today. And Neal, you said consent, consent, consent. I would add document, document, and document, because unless you have a record, it doesn't matter. So when you get the consent, make sure it's documented.
And that would be the same thing with revocation, right? You have to capture consent. You got to capture revocation.
That's right.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I'll just close with 2 quick points. One, in this space, while there's lots of complexity, simple is the easiest thing to operationalize. Simple consent and simple revocation is by far the easiest thing to operationalize. 2, I just want to note that Eric is in fact a CapitalOne customer. You heard it here, and stay away from the mugs and t-shirts, please.
So
That's
Eric,
great.
we'll hook you up with our swag guy to get, evidently there's been an issue with your merchandise. So, but we'll deal with that offline and before July, I guess. But final words?
Well, July, so you mentioned July. The guys, Compliance Palooza, July 22nd, 23rd in Las Vegas, be there. And of course, the big TCPA summit in Florida. Just book your tickets now. It's the biggest thing. 2 days of just TCPA glory. You got to be there for it. But Compliance Palooza, Great Vegas Compliance Palooza. Check it out, compliancepalooza.world, or check out tcpaworld.com, or now tcpa.world, by the way. I have so many domains. It's pretty cool. Anyway, check this stuff out. Register. It's in Vegas. It's going to be fun. You're going to learn a lot. Okay, that's all I got.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Everyone.